This is part 2 of my discussion about two distinctly different running styles that I've observed in Ironman events. And I coined the term in my first video, the terms glider and gazelle, to describe these two styles. And if you haven't seen that video, you should definitely go back and check that one out before you look at this one. I want to start this one off looking at a video from 2008 that I shot on a Lee drive of two of the men pros, Craig Alexander and Torbjorn Sindballa. And it's interesting that they're running side by side at the same pace, but they are using opposite styles. And of course, they're very different body types. Crowe being the quintessential lean, mean, super fast triathlete build, but Torbjorn was a much bigger athlete, certainly one of the biggest pros ever to podium in Kona, if not the biggest, and one of the faster cyclists that the sport had ever seen. But he did manage to get himself onto the podium one year, even though as a much bigger guy he had a lot more trouble with the heat than most of the pros out there did. But one of the things that we can see when we look at these two guys, and I want to freeze on this frame here, is that Crowe is your quintessential gazelle, whereas Torbjorn is a glider. And besides, noticing a prevalence of gliders among women athletes, smaller athletes, also I've seen it in the bigger athletes, and Torbjorn being a perfect example of that. You can see Torbjorn here is right near toe-off, right at toe-off essentially, and his front foot is well out ahead of his knee. Crowe, on the other hand, although he's not quite as far along as for toe-off, you can see that he is showing the typical glider or gazelle style, where he's basically leading with the knee. And the difference in flight is dramatic. Crowe here is a good bit off the ground, whereas you see with Torbjorn, he's staying close to the ground. And you can see here Torbjorn at toe-off. Again, he's got the foot out in front, very close to the ground. Crowe with the distinct forward lean. The lead foot still essentially under his center of gravity at toe-off, and really a forward drive with the knee, as opposed to the pendulum swing of the lower leg and foot being the forward driver of motion there. And of course we see the flight achieved by typical gazelle runners versus Torbjorn staying close to the ground here in typical glider style. Certainly Chrissy Wellington is a prime example of a glider style runner, and this is also from 2008. Now she's only 1 mile into the run here on her way out on a Lee drive. And you see really that the biggest difference in these two running styles occurs beyond this point. At this point, or at least at this point, the support phase, the runners look very similar. The one difference, and we'll look at some side-by-side comparisons, but the one difference being that the foot doesn't come up as high typically with the glider runner, their trailing foot. And then we see that before toe-off occurs, that lead leg and foot has swung down. The knee has extended on the lead leg. And it's partially that pendulum motion, as well as the extension in the back, that helps to keep the forward momentum going, or drives the runner forward. So we can look at a side-by-side of Craig the gazelle and Chrissy the glider here, and step through and sort of from the support phase and see what happens. The one difference you can see here, a very typical gazelle, typically the trailing foot has kicked up higher than you will notice with the glider. And then you'll see that although the knee seems to be progressing forward at a similar pace, that the foot, Chrissy's foot, is dropping to the ground a lot faster. So whereas it looks like Craig is essentially driving through with his knee more, Chrissy's already really opening up the knee, extending the knee, swinging the lower leg forward, so that at toe off, that leg is, the lead leg is fairly well extended, versus here the leading with the knee. And of course then the much higher and greater amount of flight. So the glider gets most of the lead leg extension before toe off, whereas the Gazelle gets it after toe off, after they've essentially already launched into the air. And the extension of the front leg helps to propel them forward while in the air. So the question is, as we discussed in the first video, the energy, the relative energy consumption of these two styles. The Gazelle will tend to have a lower turnover, and the glider will have a higher turnover. So the glider is going to take more steps per mile, but they're going to travel with less vertical movement. And so it's the question of, how much extra energy does the vertical movement take versus the extra step per mile, and that's really a subject for research study. But I suspect that those who were efficient Gazelle runners, which, as we talked about in the first video, is pretty much all elite runners, elite pure runners, get much of the, or all of the vertical displacement, which allows them to cover more ground. Essentially all of it probably comes from elastic recoil, and so that it's not requiring them much in the way of extra muscular energy, but in fact is result of essentially spring motion. And that may be probably one of the key factors to whether you can be an efficient fast Gazelle runner and probably thereby an elite runner versus not being able to do that. And if you don't have that elasticity or can't develop it, then trying to emulate the Gazelle style, the classic style, and run that way is probably not the best way to go. So I came up with a little list of factors that might predispose you to one or the other running type. So those who are more likely to be successful Gazelle runners may well have had a ball sports or a competitive running background. So they developed that elasticity while playing sports that require a lot of high-speed running. Certainly, when you're a kid running around the playground, you're going to be you're running in short, fast bursts, and you're going to be using a Gazelle style to do that. So, those who have a good background, whether it be soccer like Crowe or basketball like Rinnie has, certainly have developed a very elastic musculature that would support a good Gazelle running style. Now there's a chicken and egg thing here, because perhaps the reason they were good at those sports and played those sports, or the reason someone becomes a competitive runner, is because they have a natural proclivity for that. So they're essentially born with that elasticity. Lighter build athletes, certainly it seems to work better for. Certainly all the elite runners fall into that category. And if you're talking about getting vertical propulsion, gaining altitude, the lighter you are, the better off you're going to be, the less energy that's going to require. And certainly the greater effect that any spring motion derived from the tissues is going to have. Good glider candidates, I think a lot of everyday runners are going to fall into this category. It's a person probably who has a history of more endurance type sports. So maybe you were a swimmer, maybe you were a rower, something like that. Maybe you weren't that good at fast, quick ball sports, And so you're going to, if you're that kind of a person, chances are you're not going to naturally be a very good gazelle style runner. Certainly larger athletes, as we talked about with Torbjorn, heavier athletes, it's going to be more difficult for them to benefit from the tissue elasticity. And it also seems that small athletes with compact as opposed to lanky builds also seem to gravitate towards a glider style. Certainly older athletes should be looking at this style as an option for running. Longer distances especially also. And as I said, triathletes and everyday runners, I think this is going to be a style that a good percentage of them should at least try out or consider. Because as the old saying goes, it's not necessarily the fastest runner who wins the day, but it's the runner who slows down the least. And I think in long course triathlon that really holds true. And in my own personal experiments with these two styles, I'm a gazelle runner naturally if I don't think about it. I'm a big heavy gazelle, but that's the style that I use. But once I started studying this and I started practicing glider, it became clear to me that I was able to run almost overnight about 20 seconds a mile faster, but also that the pace seemed a lot more, or higher paces seemed a lot more sustainable to me than they did when I was running gazelle style. So then a lot of people asked after the last video, whether this is, can you switch between styles? And I'm here to tell you absolutely can with a little bit of work. It may be harder for some folks than others, but I'm no elite athlete. Yeah, I've been running for a long time, but I'm also not a typical runner type in that I'm well over 6 feet and I'm over 200 pounds. But I did shoot myself running at the track past the camera here, and at that shot right there, I'm running at about 7 flat per mile pace. So, and I'm also doing a glider style. Now we'll compare that to the same pace, but running my typical gazelle style. So here I am running the same 7 minute per mile pace with my gazelle style. So you can probably see the difference there at full speed. To take it one step further, let's look at 6 minute per mile pace. There's gliding. And here is gazelle at 6 minutes per mile. So let's look at that 7 minute per mile pace here. First, we're going to look at glider. And then we can look at gazelle. So if we do that side by side, this is the 7 minute pace, we step through it. You can see in the glider on the left that the foot, much as we saw with Chrissy, is swinging down a lot sooner and staying a lot closer to the ground. And at toe off, the foot was well out in front. Whereas here, we can see, let me get myself back toe off here on the right, we can see that the foot is further back, the knee is higher, and there's a lot more vertical displacement. Now I'm not saying I'm a model runner for either of these techniques, but this is, what can this possibly do for an everyday non-elite runner or triathlete? And the cadence is just a lot faster. Remember, I'm going exactly the same pace here, but I'm getting way ahead in the stride cycle on the gliding versus the gazelle. And there's more forward lean with the gazelle, and just a lot more vertical displacement. And even at that 6 minute per mile pace, we're gliding on the left and gazelle on the right. So you can see them staying much closer to the track on the left, foot much higher, back foot looks pretty much the same. And that's what we see, you know, in the elites too, that the extension out the back still has to happen. And the better you can do that, and the more drive you can get from the glutes, the better either style is going to work for you. There's no doubt about that. But we can see that I get ahead pretty quickly in the stride cycle here because I'm spending less time in the air, staying closer to the track. You know, here in the gazelle style, I'm 4 or 5 inches off the ground essentially. Whereas here I'm never more than an inch or two. And sure, this is the traditional style here. This is where you're going to see elite runners and elite sprinters running. But we go back to distance running, everyday people, natural tissue elasticity. Do you have it? And what speeds are you running at? And if you're running at, you know, everyday speeds, and that could be anything from 7 minutes per mile up to much slower than that. And remember here that I'm going 6 minutes per mile in this shot. That you know, the gliding style may definitely be something that's worth looking into. If not to make you any faster, minute per mile pace, to improve the sustainability of that pace, especially when you're tired. And I think that's where we really see the glider style shine versus the gazelle style.